think we are ready to our next session, and this is very exciting fire chat. So what we're going to talk about, our speakers are going to talk about is they're going to dive into the landmark research collaboration between the Doris Duke Building Bridges program, Games for Change, and Concordia University, examining 20 years of how Muslim people and Islam have been portrayed in the video games. So I would like to invite on stage our professors, Mia Consalvo and Andrei Zanescu from Concordia University from Canada.
Thank you. So I think you're just stuck with me for the presentation portion, but then we're going to have Q&A and you get to ask a bunch of questions. So I'm going to be like dual wielding a mic and a clicker. So let's make sure everything works. All right, welcome. So the plan for today is really to talk about kind of the team structure and how the project's been working. Rachel, who's a couple tables behind, and also where Doris Duke fits into all of this. Talk a little bit about the research question and some challenges that we ran into, and then I get to walk you through the game list that we came up with to survey, the findings, and some of our early conclusions. So let's go. So about a year and a half ago, we at Concordia got some messages from Rachel and G4C on behalf of the Doris Duke Foundation and their Building Bridges program. So I was looking behind me, but the screens are above. The idea was to put together a list of the top 50 best-selling games from the last 20 years, so roughly 2004 to 2024, and to kind of go through them with a large research team to survey them both qualitatively, quantitatively, and to run them through a bunch of literature that existed on this. I will not bore you with all of the minutia of how we put together the methods and everything, but feel free to ask me about it during the Q&A or afterwards. I'd be happy to talk about it. So not only the project is overseen by Rachel, and we also have an advisory board from G4C that has folks like Rami Ismail and Navid Kansari on the board. So there's a lot of oversight to make sure that everything's been running smoothly. And then at Concordia, Mia runs the project, and there's me. I do the daily operations and a lot of the sort of on-the-ground work. And we have Dr. Arwa Hussain, who's been our religious studies sort of expert consulting to put together the inventory of stuff that we were looking for in games. And then our 7 amazing RAs that made this happen. They are not here today, but they will be seeing these slides, and they're very happy about the project. So the original question that we got was to really survey the top 50 best-selling games. And for anybody who's ever tried to put together a best-selling games list, it's basically impossible for a variety of reasons. One, we don't have adequate disclosure for most game sales, but we would need to look through 20 years across every country, across every platform, across every payment method, which is virtually statistically impossible. I was liaising with some folks who are running a similar kind of project in Canada. They can do it for film, they can do it for TV and for music, but not for games. We also wanted to know what kind of platforms we were looking at, so we excised mobile fairly early on from the equation. Not that there's anything wrong with mobile, but again, different financial disclosure situations and different play styles. And then we were thinking about what format of games we were interested in, and we focused in on single player, or at least games that have a single player component. So we don't have games like Roblox or Minecraft or Genshin Impact, which are normally always online, or games as service that are really difficult to determine in terms of length. So we remade the question to top 50 single-player games between 2004 and 2024, and the top 50 we sort of put together with a weighted list that we use in Canada for determining Canadian content. So we assign points values to certain things. We surveyed a range of different websites like IGN, GameSpot, Metacritic, IMDb, PC Gamer, and I'm forgetting a couple. And we ended up with sort of a mixed sample size that has some variety of points for millions of units sold, points for 1,000 ratings on IMDb by users, and also a Metacritic score that looks at critical scores. I often make the joke that this is like the Powerpuff Girls, like putting everything into the vat. The red unexpected circumstance is people on Metacritic astroturfing or review bombing games, which is a big problem. So we had to cut out the user Metacritic scores, although I'd love to have them in. They were highly unreliable. And we ended up with this list of 50 games. I figure the pictures are too small, but the words would also be too small, so if you want the list, just hit me up and I will provide it to you. But nominally, this is mostly AAA games that you would expect to see from Sony Interactive first-party studios like Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, and also Rockstar Games, Ubisoft, EA. Some like curveballs here are Human Fall Flat, which was a game I had no idea existed before this. And some of the Nintendo games like Wii Sports and the Wii Fit Plus module. So the list was not super unexpected, and in fact we were happy that it kind of looked like what we were expecting it to be. And then we tracked it by year to see, did we have like a stronger representation? Answer is not really. There are stronger years and weaker years, but it's really hard to predict given the development cycles of AAA games. What we did find, though, was in putting together the index list, there are some games that are like orders of magnitude bigger than others in our list. So GTA 5, by far the largest game that we had on our index scale. It's 10 times the size of our number 50 game. So it weighs a lot more in terms of like how much users are circulating it or how much critics are talking about it. RDR2, similar situation, but quite smaller than GTA. And then positions 3 to 12 are about all in the same size, and then they slowly get smaller. I had all 5 pages of graphs, but it was extremely boring, like straight lines, so it's not in. So we ended up with like 3 parts of the project. I'm nominally going to be talking about the middle one, which is the quantitative coding, which is a lot of like, I can give you stats and I can talk to you about games, but I'm not going to give you like 80 pages of theory or 120 pages of qualitative coding, but those are also going to be publicly available through the white paper that's going to be coming out in the next couple of months. The only prior study that we had to rely on that looked anything like what we were trying to do was actually not for games. It was in film. It's the Real Bad Arabs book project, which had a 2nd edition and also a documentary produced on it by Dr. Jack Shaheen. He surveyed 1,000 movies, I think, in 2001, and then 1,100 movies by 2009 to determine how were Muslim people and Islam presented across almost 100 years of Hollywood history? The answer was pretty bad. So out of 1,000 movies originally, 936 negative, 52 neutral, and only 12 good. The stats kind of speak for themselves. And we also took another piece of his research into our project, which was there was an overwhelming conflation between Arabs and Muslims, such that non-Arab Muslims were effectively like not represented all that much or even discussed in film, and conversely, Arabs that were not Muslims were almost impossible to find as well. So if you're thinking of something like Syrian Christians, for example, there were none nominally discussed. We also had some discussions with our board of advisors. We talked about, for example, Turkish representation, which is like a blind spot in a lot of research and a lot of different projects. Then we put together a massive inventory of cues that we could look at in games to code. So anything from characters self-disclosing religious identity, clothing, interior decor, architecture, urban design, items, and we have I have another entire slide deck I can share with you that's about 180 pages long that students were using to code. And they were taking it into the games that we were playing and trying to find things that were either matching or not matching the inventory that we had to determine, is there Muslim representation? What does it look like? Is it negative or positive? So in total, we looked at 50 games, which is a lot less than Jack Shaheen, but the amount of time is a lot larger. A lot of these games are multiple dozens of hours, if not hundreds, in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, which almost broke one of our RAs after like 10 weeks of recording, and 750 hours of coding the findings for the games that did test positive. We have some like 250 pages, and we're going to have to like figure out a way to condense all of that so you can have access to it. So some questions that I can answer for you about these games. So we asked some sort of minutia questions not related to Islam. So for example, are the games first person, third person, or top down? So FPSs, open world adventures, or strategy games. By most measures of the games that we had, third person was the most represented. And then we had a lot of first person shooters. Call of Duties do feature quite prominently on the list. Then we asked them, does it contain representations of Islam? And 30 out of our 50 games came up positive. So out of the top 50, 30 do have something. What they have is quite variable, though. So we also had a couple of weeks of just getting students up to speed, training them up, and making sure that they were actually coding things in tandem with each other, and there was nobody who was much better or much worse. We ended up with quite strong indices of confidence, so when they said that, yes, there are representations, for about 2/3, it was like absolutely certain. For 1/3, it was like, we should probably talk about it, but yes, it is there. And for the negatives, it was even stronger. So mostly the games that were giving us trouble were fantasy representations, so things like Zelda Breath of the Wild, where there are a lot of Arabic motifs that are sort of reimagined in the Japanese context, are a bit more challenging to figure out. But we got there. Then we asked, how central is Islam to the core of the game? This doesn't mean is the religion itself important, but how likely are you to encounter it as a regular player? For about half the games, it is core, so you cannot get through the game to completion without encountering it in some way. This was a departure from a lot of other survey studies where usually games are played for about like 15 to 20 minutes, and then they're coded. We actually played the games through to completion, which for some of these is extremely long. Then we had peripheral representation, which is, it's either in a side quest or a DLC. We did some research ahead of time, so if it wasn't a DLC, we added it to the sample to like go find it. And then limited is really for tangential NPCs and things that you might not see at all. Codex entries, small like audio files, things that are included more as Easter eggs. Is the main character playable? So in the games that were positive, we asked this question. 6 came up positive, so in 6 games, you can play a Muslim-presenting or Muslim-coded character, and there is only 1 game where he is the primary character in all 50. Anybody want to take a guess? It is Assassin's Creed 1. And we've had some in-team discussion about this, because by the end of the game, I'm not even sure that the character qualifies as somebody who is Muslim, and in fact, in Assassin's Creed 2, there are like codices where he's like, all religion sucks, and we should all be a-religious. So even that's like kind of a asterisk answer. In terms of the cues we looked at, we had 11 categories, and each one of these has multiple subcategories. So characters, items, interior decor are all quite highly represented, so 25, 24, and 22 games, respectively. These are the things that we find the most. Often you'll find like a character, an antagonist in the game, but you're also likely to find items like scimitars or some kind of jewelry. And in interior decor, it might be carpets, it might be ceramics. These are things that are likely to circulate in the game. When we move to more environmental cues like sound, the outside environment, architecture, and historical references and symbols, which can be anything from religious scripture on a surface to a halal sign that you find in a Call of Duty game, these are somewhat more, they're reasonably represented, but it varies in terms of how they're combined and how you find them in games. And then when you get into the more complicated stuff, like actual geographic locations that need to be faithful to where they're drawn from, or behavioral signs, which is a term that we use for like religious practice that's done in public, so like prayer, but also recitations or anything that's spoken around you in games, or mythological references, we find a lot less of them. So nominally, the more complicated it becomes to represent something, the less of it you find in games, and we'll talk about which games you find them in. The one thing that really shocked us, I think, with the project is that compared to Jack Shaheen's work, we found a lot more positive representation than we were expecting. I'll be fully honest, I thought it was gonna be way worse than it was when we started. And we found like a pretty equal split of positive and negative. Mixed is when you have both, so there are characters that bear like the stereotypical stuff, but also some of the positive stuff. And neutral is for representations where there really isn't anything resembling a judgment attached to it. This is a lot of the games, for example, like Spider-Man 2018, there was a mosque in New York City, but there's nothing happening regarding the mosque or to it or around it. It's just there. So you're like, yes, okay, I understand the religion is present, but the game's not really telling me much about it. And then Rachel asked me to put this together a couple of days back, but we were thinking about, okay, has it evolved one way or another over the years? The white games are really the ones that had no representation, and then blue is positive, yellow is neutral, orange is mixed, and red is negative. There really isn't like an observable pattern. It is notable to me that the last time we had a game with strong positive representation was 2018, so it's been nominally like 8 years since we had a game where like Islam was presented in a positive light more generally. We have some mixed games or some neutral games. And there are games that have this kind of representation, they're just not in the top 50, so I'll mention one as we get closer to the end of the presentation. What we did find, though, is that shooter and adventure games tend to stand on opposite ends of the spectrum. So shooter games almost all have negative representation, or at least mixed. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019 is one of the mixed ones that we have, and it is quite a complicated game, to put it lightly. The only positive shooter that we have is Overwatch, where cultural cues are more treated as set dressing, or they're attached to heroic characters, so there's no like negative valence for any of these. Conversely, adventure games tended to be more positive or mixed. These largely fall into an archaeological or fantastical kind of setting, so you're finding the lost city of Ubar, or you're in the Middle Ages, generally not taking place in the modern age or in the future at all. The other thing that we did find, much like Jack Shaheen's work, is that there is virtually no presence of non-Arab Muslims or non-Muslim Arabs in these games. We have one exception, which is Uncharted 4, where there is a painting of a Mughal Muslim pirate, and it is the only time, and I had to go back into our inventory to talk to our RAs about who the Mughal empire was, because we actually did not even prepare, I think, enough for that at the time. But this remains a really vexed problem. Like, we have no mentions of Turkish folks, we have no mentions of sub-Saharan African populations that practice Islam. There's like none of this, to say nothing, for example, of like Pakistan or Central Asia. And we ended up in a bind. We found some games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare had an enormous amount of cues. I think it scored like 10 out of 11, but it was an extremely negative game, in fact, quite stereotypically so, with some exceptions. Uncharted 4 has a lot of like diverse stuff around Mughals and Moors, but not a lot of it. So it's very surface level stuff. And Assassin's Creed 1 remains one of the most deep games, I think, for showcasing a lot of religious practice around this space, but it's weird in terms of diversity and in terms of the quantity of cues. So we thought about it. Games that have density, like Call of Duty, games that have diversity, like Uncharted, and games that have depth, like Assassin's Creed, should nominally be three vectors that, if combined, would lead to better representation overall. The one game that we had very good responses from the advisory board and also from the people who were looking at this was Assassin's Creed Mirage, which is a game that has been sort of at the forefront of really foregrounding Muslim artistry, including like Abbasid calligraphy, or also taking money, for example, from the Saudi government to develop free DLC for people. So not to say the game is perfect, but there are like better versions of this to look forward to. And we're of the opinion, at least at this juncture, that this is the kind of model that should be employed by developers when they're thinking of including any kind of religious representation, but especially ones from marginalized backgrounds. I was quite inspired when we were putting together the literature review by Alexander Galloway's work on social realism versus realisticness, so moving away from the idea that better graphics or photorealism or better mechanics are somehow tantamount to having better representation, but that we should be aiming for social realism, so things that approximate lived experiences, cultural mores, familial ties, and anything having to do with a more intimate religious experience. There are a lot of games that we're still going through, so these are not part of the top 50, but they were added either through our recommendation, Rachel's recommendation, or the advisory board's recommendation. A lot of these are strategy games like Crusader Kings 2, Sword of Islam, or Age of Empires that features Saladin in a quite strong capacity, or Civilization 5, or whichever civilization that features a lot of different countries, and the Civilopedia. Fighting games like Tekken and Street Fighter that have nominally Muslim or Arabic presenting characters, and Assassin's Creed Mirage and Assassin's Creed Revelations, which feature Baghdad and Istanbul at specific points in history and give you what we're talking about, density, diversity, and depth. and also some more position games like 1979 Revolution, which has been like a talking point throughout the project. There are a lot of plans going forward. The quantitative part is mostly done, but we are now deep in the qualitative component, so we're going through these games that we still have to go through. There will be a white paper with all of these findings that will be available for you to peruse and to circulate, and I urge you to do so and to talk to us about it if you would like to. We're also collaborating with Charles University in the near future with Professor Wichlisler, who is one of the people who has most authored about this topic and has access to Arabic expertise and a lot of text that we were not able to access in English at the time we were writing the literature review. We're also eyeing a theoretical publication towards the end of the year, which is more for academic purposes, but the idea is to have it open access if possible as well. And we're also open to just talking to you about it. So if you feel like you have something to tell us, to contribute, to ask, I'm super open to it. That's it. And you have some sources, but nobody cares about those. So I'm just going to skip through them really quickly. I think we have like plenty of time for Q&A, so I'm happy to take any questions. Does yours work too?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I'm just curious, I know you had shared the confidence level of like whether, you know, an Arab Muslim was in the, or like there was context around that. I'm curious about the negative, neutral, positive. Was there any sort of like way that people, your RAs were guided or trained in like deciding what would be a negative connotation, what would be a neutral, and what would be a positive?
Yeah, so one of the components that we didn't present on was Jack Shaheen also had like a list of stereotypes that he developed within the book that we sort of adapted for games. So the closer they were to negative stereotypes, especially without like any qualification, so if they're like a terrorist or something resembling like a sheik, or there are like the timeless nomad stereotypes, these tend to fall into more negative connotations. And the more humanized they were, the more we got to talk to them about it. It was something that we often had to discuss in the more neutral cases. So students would ask, and we would confer back with the cultural expert as well, and try to figure out, you know, what the correct answer was. Especially for the mixed cases, I think it was the most complicated version.
Yeah, Andrei also ran several training sessions where he selected from a few of the game's recordings, including I think some that had none. Yes. Right? You know, that had some representation and some that had none. We all watched them together. They had the coding sheet and had to mark it on their own individually. And then we went back through it together to see, you know, like, were they, you know, basic calibration to see, you know, how confident they all were together. And it took a few rounds for it to come together, because like there were questions also of like, there's architecture, nothing's happening. Is that good? You know, at one point, you know, you're starting to think, well, they're not just shooting, so maybe this is positive, you know, or is it neutral? So we had to come to agreement on what certain things meant to be categorized in a certain way, and then, you know, like put into the code book. And also working with Arwa, our cultural expert, and she provided us with like, you know, extensive lists of things, you know, to look for, and then also images, and then we fleshed that out more and more to give folks a sense of like, you know, here are like types of items to look for, or I think you even had like music clips, you know, from like different instruments or different sounds and things, you know, so that you know what you're looking for, because, you know, our RAs, it was enough that they had all played games, and some of them were, you know, familiar with some of these games, but they were not all religious experts, and so they weren't necessarily knowing what to look for, and, you know, kind of getting everybody up to a common like language and speed took quite a bit of time.
Yeah, I think we did 2 full weeks of training, and the first round came up like 2 disparate. We had one RA who was much stronger than the others, one who was struggling a little bit more, and then we did a second round of 2 weeks, and by that one it worked out. But because we had a small sample size, it was also tricky. Of like if there was any mistake on one of the clips that we had to kind of like redo a lot of the training. Ideally, we would have had like another year and another 50 games to like grow the project a little bit more. If anybody wants to continue the project, that is something that I would recommend to do. And after we were done with the initial like reliability testing, we told students like, now we can talk about it. The reliability testing was to make sure that you were all on the same page, but there's nothing preventing us from like going back now and refiguring out if we did code things correctly or if collectively we would feel differently about it now. And in certain cases, we did ask Arwa, like, what do you think about this? We also used film a lot. So during the training period, we didn't want to like burn through the games. So we looked at movies like clips from The 13th Warrior, clips from Kingdom of Heaven, movies that were like dealing with interfaith tolerance or interfaith contact were quite useful to get the students thinking about this, which is sometimes something that I wasn't always thinking about at the start. I was like, clearly we should all be thinking about this, but not everybody was like as used to like actively looking at it.
Hi, this was super interesting. Especially, I work for the Doris Duke Foundation, so I've read your proposal and all that, so it's really awesome to see the research at this point. Something I'm curious about, it's a little bit of a two-parter. Was there really any other research about religious representation in video games, full stop, you found when you were doing your initial literature review? And regardless of that, obviously you weren't coding for anything else specifically, but I was wondering if anecdotally your RAs were finding that they were seeing representations of Islam more or less than they were seeing representations of other religions. Because I think that that's something that I'm also interested about, right? Is this something where a lot of these games are set in conflict zones in the Middle East, and so that's why we're seeing representations of Islam, versus it's just that like a lot of these games have a lot of religion in them more broadly and are seeing a lot of those cultural touch points. So I'm curious about both of those things. Thank you.
I can start, and some of the literature I'd seen prior to this, there's not a lot on real religion. There have been some papers on like religion in games, and it's often about fantasy religions in games because especially a lot of like fantasy RPGs, there are created religions within these spaces, and I've not done any research asking developers why this is, but I think part of it could be you can sidestep worrying about like getting a religion or a faith wrong if you make up your religion on your own. You think about like Dragon Age and like the Chantry system. And so there's been, you know, like some discussion of those religions and like how they might map or not map onto other spaces. But we didn't, there was really not much like about actual religions. Did you recall any?
There were a lot of case studies. So between like 2003, I guess it stopped for a while, or I pointed it wrongly. But a lot of those were having to do with specific games. So especially the Hezbollah produced Special Force game that was like a big hot button game back in 2002, 2003. Some of the SOCOM games, but these were all like very specific instances, and there were some surveys done, but there was nothing that was like really tracking religion over a long period of time. There was one study that was looking at Arabic representation, but it stopped at 2003, so it stopped right when our project starts looking at stuff, and that was really more about figuring out, is the framing conflict-based, archaeological-based, or educational-based? And there was like no big coverage of how is the religion represented, or how is the culture, is it negative, positive? So there was a lot of room to work with this, and we were actually kind of surprised by how little research has been done in the last 20 years on this topic, for some obvious reasons in terms of where like the research funding is coming from often. And the other part of this was there was like a shift in the kind of Orientalism that we saw. So games produced before 2001 often had like an Arabian Nights sort of Orientalism that was very colonial and old school, and post, there's a lot of literature talking about Neo-Orientalism and sort of like Orientalism in the era of the War on Terror, and how like geopolitics was influencing a lot of media production. in terms of other religions and stuff that the RAs saw. So I can tell you the RAs are now traumatized and are constantly sending us messages about seeing religion in other places. They're like, is this an arch I need to code? And it's like pictures of the real world or movies that they're watching. We did watch Kingdom of Heaven recently, and one of the students just like freaked out because it was like, this would take me like 4 hours to code this one screenshot. But
yeah, I think also part of what we learned from this is like the time intensity that was needed, because like Andrei is saying, and it's true, most of the prior studies have been, if there's a content analysis of a large number of games, we've looked at, and I've done this myself, 15 minutes or a half an hour of a game. Because as you saw, there was 850 hours of gameplay that was recorded for this. And so now we actually have this database, we have terabytes of data that we could go back through to say like, what are, like religion writ more broadly, or other questions, because we have all that footage. But just, getting that, like assembling that list, recording those games was itself a huge project. So if you're interested in those 50 games, and using them, you can talk with us.
Yeah. Off the top of my mind, I could probably say that the Uncharted games would feature other religions just by the virtue of how the series works, and also Assassin's Creed tends to work on binaries. So wherever you have Islamic representation, you're probably going to have Christian or some kind of other religious representation. For the Call of Duties, it's more geopolitical, so it inherits a lot of the framework around political affiliation more than faith-based affiliation, but it's another project altogether, or unto itself.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing this. This is really important analysis that you're doing, so I'm excited to learn about it. I want to kind of push a little deeper into the first question asked regarding the positive, neutral, and negative connotation coding, which those are all fairly subjective terms based off of specific user experience, based off of if the person is a white American versus if a person is Arab and non-Muslim, or if they are Muslim and Arab, and all these different identities that people hold. And I'm wondering if in your delineation of what is positive, neutral, and negative, if it was taken into account different people with different identities, experiences, and interpretations of those different things, because something that might be positive representation to one person might feel appropriative and extractive to someone else, and they might view that as negative. And I'm wondering if kind of the different user bases experiences were taken into account into those three codings.
Yeah, I'll start and then you can go more detail. I mean, that's a really good question, and part of that, either the subjectivity or the more depth will come with a qualitative analysis, which will be, they've been doing some of the basic marking up of the footage, but we'll be writing about more to talk about like, what does this mean? And, it's more than just like a architecture, if there's a quest involved, like what's going on, how is it impacting the characters or the plot line? Does anything in the game world change as a result of this, or is it just kind of like an add-on piece that was thrown in? So some of that will come forward. We also were thinking about that in relation to building the team. So like the team of coders, the graduate students do come from a mix of backgrounds, ethnicities, religions. And our cultural expert, we had her meet with the team several times in the beginning as we were getting together and starting the recording, and then also with the coding, to give them further insights. Do you want to talk more about?
I think it's like freaking out a little bit. Oh no, there we go. We had a lot of specific cases where one student, for example, would come up to the team. We had weekly meetings for the entire year, so the point of meetings was to go over a lot of the findings. And for example, we had one of the Call of Duty games to feature the Mujahideen, and there was a lot of discussion about like, are they featured as a positive force, a negative force, more morally complicated, especially to the in relation to the player positionality. So the representations were always considered relative to how the player is intended to view the experience or positioned relative to the Muslim people or the culture altogether. So we had some cases that I think were quite complicated, and they were illuminated by other games. So for example, Uncharted 3, we had a fairly large-scale representation of Yemen where Muslim practice or people who are nominally Arabic are actually presented quite neutrally or quite positively, and that helped the students in discussion and showcasing video samples to figure out, okay, am I supposed to feel like negatively or positively about one or another characters. We did not have quite as many edge cases that we had to like discuss quite profoundly. I think students found that the games are actually like quite telegraphed in whether or not you're supposed to empathize or disengage from Muslim figures. And probably Assassin's Creed 1 is the only game where it's a bit more complicated because religion altogether is presented as kind of a negative force. But in general, we did have people contribute expertise. One of our RAs, for example, is from Ankara and often would step in to sort of correct or provide a different perspective when somebody was misunderstanding. Likewise, we had games like Grand Theft Auto where people who are not from America did not really recognize images pertaining to Afghanistan or the Iraq War that our American RAs helped flesh out a little bit more, like you should be thinking about this. So there's a lot of discussion backwards and forwards. That being said, one of the recommendations for the project at the end will be that this should be taken up by Muslim folks who are doing this kind of scholarship or experts to kind of run forward with this. The idea of the project is to provide that kind of basis because there's a lot.
And I'm a qualitative researcher just in practice, and so for me it chafes to just like boil everything down to good, bad, or sort of, you know, in the middle. And so like this is providing you with the broad view snapshots, but I think more of the complexity and the depth will come out in the qualitative report. And also, like we said, we kept talking about some of the more interesting examples, like how is this working in a game like Crusader Kings or Age of Empires or 1979 Revolution, but those, you know, were not in that data set, you know, but we wanted to include them, so we'll, you know, have them as an addendum, you know, to talk about those games as well, because there are far more interesting games coming out of like the indie space and since then, but, you know, we also wanted to see, and it's important to know, like, what are the top 50 games saying and doing? And this is, you know, like, these are the games that we're talking about sales largely in the West, so that are being presented to a Western audience. Like, what is a presumed Western audience seeing or not seeing? It would be a very interesting and probably very different study to look at, like, what is a list of the top 50 games in the Middle East and North Africa, you know, and how is that different or the same? How are developers in those areas creating games that are creating different types of representations for different types of players?
One of the issues we had with building the top 50 sales list is I talked to one of our former colleagues, and they were like, well, what are you doing with everybody who comes from a country where like disposable income is much lower and there's a lot of piracy, so a lot of these games are being played for free or shared among households? I was like, that's a very good point, and the numbers will never capture that, which is why we went to user reviews, because we were like, okay, these games are nominally circulating more, people are talking about them more. But yeah, there's a lot of like occluded data, like people that we don't see or that should be taken into account, and that's something to develop for future work, I think.
You started to answer this, but maybe you could expand on it. I'm interested in the indie games that you saw, whether there's any really interesting case studies of things that you thought were authentic representation or co-creation that stood out that you'd want to highlight is one. And then I have a very specific question that I think I know the answer. In any of the games, was there actual where the player did a religious practice, not just was near a mosque, or actually did a religious practice? So 2 questions.
I can answer the second one with a resounding no. Which is very interesting because even among the Assassin's Creed games, for example, there's a lot of Shinto prayer or ritual tattooing in Valhalla, like the games that are not dealing with Islam have a lot of religious practice elements in them. The games that do feature Islam do not have that. And in none of the games, even when it is featured positively, is there some kind of prayer mechanism or moving into sacred spaces to do any of that. So that I can answer for sure as nope.
And maybe linked to that, I was mentioning the fantasy religions and the Dragon Age example again. I mean, there's a lot of examples where you can, you're role playing as a character in these games and you can be a religious character. Like you can choose options where your decisions are guided by your faith within the game. And so, again, I think it's, falling back on the safety of the fiction, and not wanting to get things wrong. But like that's a huge gap in terms of what games are offering people, at least in this scale of game. And in terms of highlights, did you want to? Yeah, or even like the RTSs, I think would be interesting.
The RTS example? Yeah, so one of the things that has been sort of on the periphery of the study, because we started in 2004, which was sort of the mandate, is there are a lot of games that were produced in the Middle East, either funded by Dar al-Fikr or Hezbollah, that are not part of the study, and those are quite strongly positioned games against SOCOM and Call of Duty, which I think have been discussed in literature and are incredibly important. Unfortunately, we have only a few games that are really from the indie space, like 1979 Revolution, which we talked about with the board, and we spoke with some of the artists who are on the board, and they were talking about like potential plans, but there really hasn't been all that much there. It's really in the AA space that there is some stuff, and when it's more historically minded that we see. In particular, like Age of Empires 2 features an entire campaign where you are like somebody who is next to Saladin, and so you're seeing like the Crusades from the other perspective, and it is actually, of the 5 campaigns, the only one where the leader is presented positively as sort of a stabilizing force. Civilization has some weird stuff where you get to nominally like slap a symbol of Islam on your religion, call it whatever you want, but the way it behaves or the way that you're supposed to use it is in a very colonialist manner in general. You're supposed to like spread and dominate the globe. That's true whether it's Christianity or Islam or any kind of, we had a colleague produce like a crab-based religion for fun. So those games, I think, nominally are doing religion or like thinking about religion, but they think about it systematically. It's not really thought about in the way that people experience it or in terms of like daily life. Not related to this project, the thing that's been on my mind with this is back in 2022, I was in Athens talking to some folks who were working in Europe, and there were a lot of Greek scholars, and they were constantly telling me we're very annoyed that there's always Greek mythology in games because we hate that shit. It's actually like quite tied to ultranationalism in Greece, and we wish somebody would just make a game about like a Greek fisherman or like the politics of like a boat dock. And so I think about that a lot because that's the stuff that we don't really get in AAA productions because of the push towards photorealism and high production value. Like nobody's doing the small experiences. This is a call to anybody who wants to make these kinds of games, please do.
I noticed some of the games that, first of all, thank you for doing this talk. This was awesome. Second, I noticed that some of the games that were in the presentation, the 2 that caught my eye were Legend of Zelda, I believe that was Tears of the Kingdom, and Animal Crossing New Horizons. I understand that it's like Arab representation, but I don't quite understand how it's like Muslim representation. I guess what's your thought process behind that?
So those games walked in because they were in the top 50, and then we had to deal with them, and we had one RA who bravely undertook being the Nintendo person. So we had a lot of discussions about particularly the Gerudo in both Zelda games, and really sort of like a process of fantasy representation. This was something we talked about with the advisory board, which was like, what do we do with something that is not nominally Muslim or Islamic in the proper sense, but takes all of the like imagery or objects that you might find and then like remixes them. And particularly, this is a problem that we had with Japanese games that are like doing cultural adaptation quite differently than Western games. So we decided to include them, and they're like in a very like asterisk sort of subsection where we have to talk about like fantasy representations of Muslim imagery. The Witcher 3 is the other game that has some of this, where it's like a lot of Middle Eastern or Southeast European like versions of this that are remixed. In Animal Crossing, it's a bit different because there is nothing religious, but there is a camel called Sahara who sells things like gutras and kefiyas and thobes, and has a lot of like carpets, so you can buy all of the objects that you might find at a bazaar, and is in fact like sort of a way to do home decor. But there is, that's really proceeding from the Arabic being attached as an Islamic representation. But these are some of the more complicated games that we had in the study. So I'm glad you asked, because we struggled for quite many weeks figuring out what to do with these, and in the end, our cultural representative, expert Arwa, was like, you should include them. And you should just like mark them up as being slightly different, but they are important because there is a lot of like cultural contact where people are seeing how we dress and how we decorate our homes, but it's like completely dislodged from that context, and it becomes like just a tchotchke that you can put into your house. So
I think we're out of time.
like
So that
on
is
the dot.
Perfect, yeah.
One brave soul.
Or we'll be outside if you want to grab us separately.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia. Thank you so much, Andrei.